Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the National Gallery and to this talk on Holbein's ambassadors. I'm Susan Foister. I'm Director of Public Engagement and also the curator here who's lucky enough to have Holbein's masterpiece under her care. So I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes or so talking about this very extraordinary painting, but I don't think I'm going to be able to provide all of the answers, and of course I'll be very happy to try to answer any questions that you may have afterwards. So this is a painting that the National Gallery acquired back in 1890. It looked a bit different then. The background, that green curtain, had been painted out. It was very dark. Other bits were not in such clear condition as they are now, and nobody knew who the two people here were. The painting had been in England for most of the 19th century, and in 1890 it was in the collection of the Earls of Radnor at Longford Castle. And they still own the wonderful portrait of Erasmus over on the wall just next to you there, which is on loan to the National Gallery. They still have a wonderful collection at Longford, and if you're interested in it and its history and how you can buy tickets to visit it, then do have a look on the National Gallery website because all the information is there. So in 1890, we were able to raise enough money with some very generous gifts to acquire this painting. And opinions differed as to who these two men might be. Some people thought that they might be English. The poet Sir Thomas Wyatt was one hopeful suggestion. It was thought they might be two young Germans, but nobody at the time thought that they might actually be two Frenchmen, as we now know they are. And it wasn't until 1900 when the art historian Mary Harvey published her wonderful book on Holbein's ambassadors, which is still a wonderful book, and I commend it to you, that the fruits of her research were revealed. She was able to show the painting's history through collections in France and trace it back to the family of this man, Jean de Dinteville, about whom I'll say more in just a moment. But let's first of all come to the artist, Hans Holbein the Younger. The one thing that wasn't in doubt when this painting was acquired for the National Gallery was the artist, the famous Hans Holbein. And you can see here, or you may want to come up afterwards and look very closely at the painting to see it. It's a little bit of a gloomy patch, but it's definitely there. Holbein's signature in Latin saying that Holbein painted this picture or was painting this picture in 1533. And it's an unusually long and elaborate signature for Holbein. He doesn't always sign his paintings, and when he does, it's often a lot briefer than that. And I take from that Holbein thought this was a pretty important picture to give his name to. And it is a most extraordinary picture in his work as a whole. Now, Holbein, as you may know, was born in Germany, spent a number of years working in Basel in Switzerland, and then first came to England in 1526. And his Basel patron, the humanist Erasmus, had recommended him to a number of notable people in England, including the Archbishop of Canterbury and Sir Thomas More. He stayed in England for a couple of years. During that time, he worked for Henry VIII at the Palace of Greenwich, painting some spectacular paintings for a temporary entertainment tent. And then he came back again. And we know he was back by 1532, and then in 1533, he paints this extraordinary picture. And by this time, he was probably back in full view of Henry VIII and almost certainly carrying out some work for him. So his fame was already well established in England. But he had never before tried a large life-size, life-scale portrait of two people at full length. He was not the first artist in history to have made a full-length double portrait like this of two men. There are examples we can trace back into the 15th century. But Holbein had never done anything like this before. It must have caused quite a stir in London, but it seems likely that the painting didn't hang around and that this man, Jean de Dinteville, for whom it was painted, took it back to France with him, where it stayed until the end of the 18th century, really pretty much hidden from view. And that in itself is an extraordinary story, I think, of such a remarkable painting and yet mostly hidden from view for several centuries of its history. Now, Jean de Dinteville was a remarkable young ambassador. He was sent as French ambassador to London 5 times in all, and in 1533 he was on his second tour of duty, and he was pretty reluctant to be here. He wanted to be back home in France. He had a beautiful chateau, the Chateau of Policy, in Burgundy, just south of the town of Troyes, and he was rebuilding it. He was improving it. He had lots of ideas, and fortunately for us, he left a good deal of correspondence, so we can trace this 1533 tour of duty and what he felt about it. Unfortunately, what he doesn't mention in any of that correspondence is Holbein, his relationship with the artist, and the painting of this picture. We would love to know more about that, but I think we can only speculate. So Jean de Dinteville came to London in 1533 at the beginning of the year and was lodged in Bridewell Palace, which is on the east side of the city of London, and it's where the ambassadors were normally put. He was ill for much of the time. It seems that he had something very similar to malaria, so he was constantly ill. It wasn't just a cold or flu, though he did complain about the English weather. He had to stay in England because 1533 was a really momentous year. Henry VIII had managed to divorce Catherine of Aragon and was going to marry Anne Boleyn in May 1533. And of course, this situation, this political situation, the break with Rome, was causing tremendous trouble and disquiet in Europe. And it was something that Jean's master, Francis I of France, was very concerned about. So it was a pretty serious year to be the French ambassador in London. So he was expecting to stay for the marriage, for the coronation in June, and then he found he had to stay longer because Anne was pregnant with Henry's heir at that time. Of course, he hoped it was going to be a boy, and it turned out in September to be Queen Elizabeth I. But that meant that Jean had to stay on even longer for the birth, and Francis was going to be godfather to that child. So he was in London for the long haul then. He was miserable, he was ill, he wanted to go back to sunny France, and he somehow had to keep himself occupied. He had to spend a lot of money as well. He complained about that a lot when he had to attend the coronation. He had to kit himself and his followers out in new outfits, and he had to hold a banquet and pay for it. So he did have these diplomatic tasks, but the prospect of commissioning Holbein to paint this wonderful portrait must have really kept his spirits up for quite a long period. We don't know how long Holbein took to paint this picture, but there must have been, as I hope to show you, an awful lot of thought that went into it, a lot of conversations with Jean, between Jean and Holbein, that we can only now really imagine. Now, Jean makes a big impression here, and I think part of that is through what he is wearing, these wonderful pink and black clothes, these very fashionable clothes that Holbein depicts him in. And this painting is not just Holbein showing off his compositional abilities, his abilities as a portraitist, but also his ability to render these wonderful textures of fabric, that extraordinary pink satin sleeve, this lynx fur. I mean, lynx was a very, very expensive fur with these long hairs, and when you get to the edges of where the fur overlaps, say, the curtain, you can see Holbein picking out the individual long hairs, so you get the sense of the deep texture of that fur. Then there are lots of little details. For example, the way in which the slashings of the sleeve there are held together with these tiny little gold tags. And then this wonderful gold dagger in its scabbard, which gives us one of the clues in this painting to the identity of Jean, because there's a number here which relates to his age. It tells us that he's in his 29th year, so he's 28. And hanging from the dagger is this absolutely beautiful representation of an enormous tassel. It's blue and gold. And the way in which Holbein has represented particularly the gold thread of that tassel is in complete contrast to this rather free way in which he's painted the pink satin or the fur of the lynx. It's immensely detailed, and he's used a technique in which he would have painted out the areas where the gold was going to fall with glue, and then he would have put gold leaf on top of the glue, and it would have stuck to where the areas where the glue was, and then been brushed away from the other areas, and you're left with this extraordinarily beautiful detailing of the tassel using real gold leaf. Do come up and look at it very closely afterwards. It really repays a lot of close study. Or go on our website and you'll see not just the usual zooming images, but a link to a Google image of this painting, which is something quite extraordinary. And if you zoom into that, you will see details that it is really almost impossible to see with the naked eye, even if you get very, very closely to the painting. So I recommend looking at the Google image of this painting. All the information that we have about this picture is there. So Jean de Dinteville is shown standing at full length, and he's pretty broad as well. In some ways, this representation and even this double portrait is a dress rehearsal for Holbein's representation of Henry VIII at Whitehall Palace, a painting that he made in 1537, but which doesn't survive. It was burnt down when the palace burnt down at the end of the 17th century. But we do have records of it, including Holbein's original cartoon for the left-hand side, which is on view next door at the National Portrait Gallery. And again, you see this full-length figure, very, very broad, with these broad shoulders, these padded, puffed shoulders. So, perhaps Henry VIII even saw this painting, or perhaps a drawing, a sketch of it, and Holbein was then commissioned to make that image of Henry. It's just a thought, but this is a very impressive image of a man. Another rather extraordinary detail is up there on his hat. Now, there are gold decorations there. There is also a little hat badge of a skull. And it was quite fashionable for people to wear hat badges of various types in the 16th century and at the Tudor court and the French court. But that little badge of a skull perhaps gives us a clue to something that was of particular interest to Jean de Dinteville, as we'll see. Now, Dinteville was a very erudite, educated man. He was an important and trusted figure at the court of King Francis I of France. He had the care of the king's youngest son a little while before he became an ambassador. So he would certainly have been trusted to convey messages from the King of France to the King of England. But there was another messenger who came to London in 1553, and this is the man on the right, Georges de Selve. Now, as is the case with Jean, his friend, we've got a clue as to his age, which is just on the edge of the book there. So again, these are two young men in their 20s. Georges, not yet quite 25, but he had already been made Bishop of Lavaur. But he was actually too young to be consecrated and to wear the bishop's robes, which is one reason why he may be portrayed instead wearing this absolutely sumptuous fur-lined robe. You can see here the outer facing of the fur, but it must go all the way underneath the robe. And the robe itself is made of this rather beautiful browny purpley silk damask with this very, very large pattern on it. And the size of that pattern is a good indication as to the expense of this fabric. So although it might look at first sight quite sober dress, it's very, very expensive dress. Now, what was Georges de Selve doing in London? Well, we have some clues because there are a couple of letters in which Jean de Dinteville mentions his visit. He may have been in London as early as mid-April, but we know by early June he'd gone, so it wasn't a long visit. Jean says how wonderful it's been to have his friend Georges on this visit. It's really cheered him up. But the motive for the visit seems to have been kept secret. It was probably bringing another message from Francis to Henry VIII, but we may never know exactly what message. We do know, though, that Georges was very concerned with the breakup of Christendom, with the split in Christianity between the Lutherans and the Catholic Church, and he would have been very concerned by Henry's break with Rome. Now, the fact that we can narrow down the months for this visit to really the space of about a month and a half means that we can also home in on when this painting must have been conceived with Holbein. It must surely have been conceived during those spring months when Georges de Selve visited London and Jean de Dinteville decided that there should be a portrait which included them both. Perhaps he'd been thinking of commissioning something much less elaborate from Holbein himself, but Georges' visit must have crystallized the idea of this double portrait of the two friends together. What we don't know is how Holbein went about making this portrait. We do know that for portraits normally, Holbein would make a drawing of his sitter, and actually we have a large number of those drawings, about 80 or so of them. They still survive, most of them in the royal collection. And in a number of cases, we can match up the drawing of the sitter with the painted portrait. We can only assume that Holbein made drawings of Jean and of Georges while he was here so briefly, as well perhaps as studies for the objects in the painting, but no drawings survive. Georges' face is perhaps not as animated as some of those that Holbein was painting around this time. Maybe he didn't actually have very long with him. We just don't know. And we don't know how long Holbein took to paint this picture. If he started planning it, say, in April or May, he might have spent some months painting it, but he did paint a number of other works in 1533. We don't know. There are some suggestions that he might have been working quite quickly at times on this picture. There are certainly a couple of instances where we can point to him taking what might seem to be shortcuts. So, for example, if we look at the way this beautiful oriental carpet is painted, if you look at that closely, you'll see he's depicted the tufts of the carpet, quite literally using a rather thick brush and dabbing with the ends of the brush there to give the effects of the tufts. And between the tufts, you can see a dark grey background. Now, that might be the substrate of the carpet on which the tufts are woven, but it is also the ground of the painting. So we know that Holbein started off with this large panel made up of a number of oak planks, and he covered it with quite a dark grey ground. So when he came to paint the carpet, he already had something to work with, and that suggests he was working quite quickly. And again, with that green curtain in the background, if you look rather closely at the pattern in the background of it, and it's all painted quite economically, there aren't sort of many layers there, he's laid out the pattern and then he's made the folds over the top. So the pattern's actually quite a flat pattern laid out first of all, and then he's rather cleverly introduced the idea of the folds of the curtain, which I think, is quite convincing. But again, it's a sign that he was perhaps being very economical in the way that he approached this. Now, everybody wonders what these objects are doing in the picture. You're probably wondering the same thing. So I need to tell you a little bit about the objects on the top shelf and the objects on the lower shelf, and then we'll speculate a little bit about what they're doing in the picture. The objects on the top shelf are all, if you like, to do with heavenly bodies, and the objects on the lower shelf might be seen to have something to do with the earth. And you've certainly got a globe of the heavens right on the top there, and you've got a globe of the earth down there. Now, there's a whole medley of instruments on that top shelf which were used for telling the time, using the rays of the sun, locating the sun and other heavenly bodies when you were wanting to work out the time of the day, or obviously if you were somebody at sea, you would be wanting to work out your location from the positions of the heavenly bodies. So there are lots of different types of instrument here. We know that Jean de Dinteville was quite interested in instruments of this kind. In his letters, there's a reference to an oval compass, which is probably an instrument rather along the lines of one of those depicted here. We don't know if he owned any of these instruments, but somebody else who may have been involved in the discussions around this painting was a man called Nicholas Kratzer, who was a German and who was the astronomer to King Henry VIII. And he was a friend of Holbein. Holbein painted his portrait in 1528, and interestingly, it includes several of these instruments. The paintings in the Louvre, you can see it there, or you can look for it online. And if you compare it with this painting, you will see the similarities between the objects. So they may or may not be exactly the same objects, but they seem to be variations on a theme. And we can speculate that Nicholas Kratzer may have been involved in the conversations between Jean de Dinteville and Holbein about what to represent here. So next to the sphere of the heavens, showing a number of the constellations, you've got a little cylindrical dial there that you could hold it up with its string. You'd have to be outside where the sun was shining. Mysteriously, this appears not to be outside, but there are shadows reflected here, and then it would give you an idea of the time of the day. you needed to know which month was being referred to, there are two possibilities here. One is April, which would fit in quite well with what we know about Georges de Selve's visit, and another would be August. When you actually start to try to lock down what these instruments might be saying about dates and about times, actually you get into quite a lot of difficulty. With this polyhedral dial there with a little compass on the top, it's actually set for different times, not radically different, but different times in a morning, 9:30, 10:30, for example. So it's not evidently meant to show anything accurate. When you look at these quadrants up here, there are various inaccuracies about the way in which they're represented, a few unexpected features. On the right-hand side here is a very elaborate instrument called a torquetum, and we know that Nicholas Kratzer, the astronomer, was interested in these instruments, and he may have tried to build one. This is a wooden instrument like the others, and he may perhaps have had one. Certainly people at the French and English courts would have been interested in these instruments, which go back to ancient Greek astronomy, and in the Renaissance people were very interested in trying to recreate them and in what and how they might be used, again in relation to the position of the heavenly bodies, telling you the time in more elaborate ways. Now, some people have theorized and speculated that there are a lot of hidden meanings here and that one can be very precise about dates and times. I'm not convinced that's absolutely the case at all. I think what is more interesting is the disparity and the inaccuracies here are, for example, the times meant to be shown deliberately out of joint, for example. Certainly what was going on in Europe at this time and in London was very concerning. Now, I think there may also be intended to be a bit of a division between left and right in the painting as far as the objects are concerned, in particular related to two of the objects on the lower shelf. Because this earthly globe, which is placed right next to Jean de Dinteville, doesn't just tell us that Europe is there, well, it's upside down, but it is there, and England and Ireland at the lower part because it's upside down. It shows us France, sure enough, Paris is located, but also located, really pretty much in prime position in the middle, is Jean de Dinteville's own chateau of Policy. So that's very, very clearly spelt out. And he's saying, I think, that's what I own. That's where I live usually. So I don't think it's accidental that it's right next to him. There is a very interesting aspect, though, to the way that Holbein has portrayed some of these names. Paris is there, spelt not with a P, but with a B, Barris. And that's perhaps a clue to the way that Holbein spoke French. One of the mysteries is how well Holbein actually spoke English and how he and Jean de Dinteville actually communicated. I think that's going to remain mysterious. On the right-hand side here, near to Georges de Selve, is a hymn book. And what's interesting is this is a Lutheran hymn book. So it shows you 2 pages with hymns in the German language. It's a Lutheran hymn book, and that may be a deliberate reference to Georges de Selve's interest in trying to bring together this split in Christendom. In 1529, it seems, he had actually spoken at one of the European meetings, the diets called by the Emperor Charles V, to address this issue of the split, and his speech was later published, and in it he pleads for the Christians to come together once more. So this perhaps may be a reference to that. What's particularly interesting about it is that it looks like a very accurate rendering of a book, and in many ways it is. But when you compare it to the original on which it's based, you find that those two hymns are not in those consecutive places in the hymn book. They've been deliberately placed, deliberately chosen from different places in that hymn book, and they're put together. And one of them says, "Come, Holy Ghost," so that maybe is a bit of a plea for reconciliation. And the other is Luther's rendering of the 10 Commandments, which was something, after all, that both the Lutherans, the Protestants, and the Catholics still had in common. So maybe that's what it's doing there. Above it is this beautiful rendering of a lute in perspective. I think Holbein is showing here, as with his beautiful rendering of D'Anteville's clothes, that he can do something quite difficult to show this lute in foreshortening. One of the things that may not be completely obvious until you come close to the lute, though, is that there's something wrong. One of the strings has broken. If you look at the edge of the lute just there, you may be able to just see that curving broken string like a single hair at the edge of the lute. So this lute is not in perfect harmony. That's one string is broken, and perhaps that too has a meaning. There's a case of flutes here, bore musical instruments, but one of them, it's been noted, is missing. So is that again a reference to some lack of harmony? We don't know. Over on this side is an arithmetic book. It's propped open with this set square there, and there's a pair of dividers behind. So measuring and geometry is very much to the fore here, earthly measurement as opposed to the celestial measurement on top. And the page that's been chosen here in this book is interesting. This is a very accurate rendering, again, of a page from a German arithmetic book by somebody called Peter Appian. And the page here is all about division. It's about methods for division. Again, is this a reference to the division in Christendom at this time? We don't know for sure. But one thing I think we can be absolutely certain of, and that is the presence of two more objects in this painting which take it into a completely different dimension. And by that I mean this object here and the semi-hidden object top left there. This object puzzled people for many, many years. In the 19th century, one of the curators working at the National Gallery, who was quite a Holbein expert, puzzled over it and concluded it was a fish bone, a cuttlefish bone, he thought. Well, it is bone, he was right about that, and the painting wasn't in the excellent condition that it's in now, today. So this is much more visible, and if you stand to the right-hand side of the painting, it suddenly snaps into perspective. It's a distorted representation of a human skull. This is a technique that was known in the 16th century. Leonardo da Vinci was interested in it. Later on, there were books published telling artists how to make these distorted representations. If you go next door to the National Portrait Gallery, you'll see an extraordinary portrait of the future King Edward VI, distorted in its original frame. And that's interesting because that frame has at one side a space for a sort of telescopic viewing device. So we know how that painting was viewed. This is not the original frame of this picture. This was made for it at the National Gallery, and we don't have any information on how this skull might have been viewed. So you might have been asked to step away and view it from this side, or you might have been presented with a little glass cylinder, and if you stepped back from the painting and looked directly at it using the glass cylinder, again, the skull would snap into its correct perspective. undoubtedly producing this convincing image of a skull which moves when we move and has been distorted in this extraordinary way is a great feat for an artist. And we don't know exactly how Holbein did it. Some of the instruction books would tell you how to square up a drawing and then copy it square by square. We don't know whether that's the method Holbein followed or whether he may have used some more sophisticated method, perhaps illuminating a drawing and throwing a shadow on a wall is one suggestion. But it is extraordinarily convincing. It's a tour de force. And of course, it may just relate to that little skull hat badge that we saw at the beginning of Dinteville's own emblem and own interest in this. Now, there's one place in Holbein's work where we can find an image of a skull with two full-length figures on either side, and it's the very last woodcut in Holbein's famous series of The Dance of Death, in which death is triumphant, finally. So Holbein may have got the idea from that composition. We can perhaps imagine him showing Jean de Dinteville his idea for that. And there were many paintings in this period in which people wanted to be shown with a skull as a reminder of the fate that befalls everybody. And if you're proud enough of your appearance to have yourself painted, it was often good to have that reminder, well, you're not around forever. You don't want to be accused of being perhaps too vain, so the skull might be included in that way. But Holbein, of course, has gone much further. He has hidden this reference to a skull. Sometimes you get skulls on the backs of paintings. He has hidden this on the front of his painting in clear view. It's an extraordinary feat. And I think we're meant to relate it to what we can see top left, and I think it's deliberately partly concealed there. It's a silver crucifix seen from the side. And for Christians, that, of course, was a reference to the hope of salvation. Again, something that united all Christians at this time. So I think in experiencing this painting, you were meant to go from experiencing the sense of mortality that befalls everybody, no matter how magnificently dressed or well-educated, it comes to everybody. But then there is the hope of salvation and ultimate resurrection, according to the Christian doctrine. So I think in a way, it's very difficult to sum up what Holbein is doing here, but I think he has added a sense of an extra dimension to a portrait of these two young men and these extraordinary objects. It's rather like the famous quote from Hamlet. I may get this slightly wrong, but I think it's Hamlet who says to Horatio, there are more things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in your philosophy. And I think in a way that's what Holbein shows us here in paint. Thank you.